right. Hello, everybody. My name is Emily DeLay. I'm a 2024 UD Entrepreneurship graduate and incoming UD graduate student in Fashion Apparel Studies. Today, we are very pleased to have Michael Lambert, Executive Director of Global Trade and Compliance at Urban Outfitters, join us as a guest speaker for the FASH455 interview series. Michael currently also serves as the Vice Chair of the Board of Directors of the U.S. Fashion Industry Association, and I will also be joined by Dr. Sheng Liu for this interview. The interview series provides a unique learning opportunity for our students to hear from industry experts on pressing apparel sourcing and trade issues. For today's interview, we will invite Michael to share his firsthand insights and observations about trade compliance and apparel sourcing, which is growing in importance for fashion brands and retailers. So thank you so much again for joining us, Michael. First of all, could you please just give our students a brief introduction to your experiences in the fashion apparel industry, particularly what makes you passionate about this sector?
Great, and thank you for the introduction, Emily. I'm looking forward to the interview. Yeah, so I go pretty far back in the fashion apparel industry, back to actually prior to when the WTO was formed. So, I've been in trading compliance for upwards of 30 years here with a number of major fashion apparel retailers around the country. Recently, I was, prior to my time at Urban Outfitters, at Victoria's Secret for 10 years, 2 of those years in London, setting up compliance there. And I've been at Urban Outfitters for the last 11 years. And really what I'm most passionate about the sector, not just that having 3 daughters enables me to stay in touch with what's happening in the fashion industry sector, is I've just really been impressed with the changes that I've seen, this very smart people, very creative people, to see what goes on in the design phase, but then taking it through the design phase to the business phase and actually then selling to the ultimate consumer, which I've been lucky to be on the retail side for all the companies I've worked with. And one of the things that I've seen firsthand is just how much of a difference it can make when you have a good mix of product and people to deliver what the customers are looking for.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And so now let's dive into trade compliance. So as Urban's Director of Global Trade and Compliance, what are your primary job responsibilities? And specifically, can you elaborate on why trade compliance is crucial for fashion companies today? You talked about the beauty of being on the retail side and watching how brands can execute to please the consumer. How does trade compliance fit into this, process?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I've learned being in this industry for quite some time is just how important it is working with all the government agencies that dictate the rules and regulations that the fashion industry has to comply with. And just to give you an idea of the importance of trade compliance, when I first started at Urban Outfitters about 11 years ago, we had 8 people on the team. We've got 35 on the team now. One of the things I like to tell people all the time on the team is global trade and compliance never gets less complex. It only ever gets more complex. And one of the things I like to look at from the perspective of where we are is our job is to make sure that the product that's manufactured all over the world, and at Urban Outfitters, we have a tremendous factory base throughout the world, but all of that has to come through the single portal of U.S. Customs into the U.S. and comply with all the trade and compliance requirements there. So that's really where I got my start, is on the customs side, on the importation of product. Just to give everyone an idea out there of the additional tariffs that you pay when you bring the product in, we pay anywhere from 15 to 35% additional duty on top of the cost of the goods to the US government when we import. So for a company like Victoria's Secret or Urban Outfitters, that's a significant portion of the cost of goods. And we have to make sure that when we enter those products, that they comply with all the rules and regulations of US Customs. So that's one of the key functions that I have here at Urban. But what has really changed over the last few years has been a focus on social responsibility and sustainability as it relates to different aspects of our business. Social responsibility from the perspective of, in the past, a lot of the work that we did was ensuring that we were doing business with ethical companies around the world, but it was really voluntary and self-regulating. In the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen a real shift in what's happening with the US government and their concerns around forced labor in the supply chain. So social compliance has become very much a regulatory piece of global trade and compliance to ensure that you don't have any forced labor in the supply chain, because that could lead to what we call an admissibility issue, where the goods might not even be able to be imported into the United States. So we have customs compliance, social compliance, sustainability, with a lot of state laws that are going into effect with regard to the environmental impact of all the sourcing we do around the world that rolls up into global trade and compliance at Urban Outfitters. And then the other two areas that I focus on are regulatory compliance. So that is all of the state, local, and national laws that apply to the sale of our product. So if you see a label on your fashion when you go into a store to buy, you'll see care, you'll see content, you'll see country of origin. All of those are laws that are enforced by the Federal Trade Commission to ensure that the customer is making an informed buying decision. And our department has to make sure that everything we sell meets those regulatory requirements. And then finally, the last part of global trade and compliance at Urban Outfitters is vendor operations. So obviously, we're dealing with factories and agents all over the world. We have to ensure that they comply with all of Urban's requirements, as well as all the legal requirements. So the vendor relations team is responsible then to onboard all the new vendors and then work with them if we have issues with them not complying with things that we expect them to do.
Sure. Thank you so much for joining us again, Michael. Recently, I work with the U.S. Fashion Industry Association for the annual benchmarking study. You're part of it. So this year, very interesting. The surveyed leading U.S. fashion companies told us, somehow they're facing growing sourcing risk, growing compliance risk. So from your observation, what actually happened? What has caused the rise in compliance risks?
And that's a great question, and it's something that we're dealing with quite a bit here, at Urban Outfitters. And I'd say the first concern that we have are just supply chain risks around transportation. Certainly with the different products that we source all over the world, with some of the hot spots in terms of conflict, maybe in the Middle East, where we've had to divert container ships to get our product into the US. That's been a bit of a challenge. Just finding space on ocean vessels and air planes to get the product here has been a challenge. So really one of the biggest risks around sourcing is just that supply chain risk. The other two big things that I think that we have a concern with is one that I've already touched on, which is the concern with forced labor, with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. Is it really has put the onus on many importers into the United States, but in particular fashion importers, because of the use of cotton, potentially the use of cotton from the Xinjiang region in China. There's been a lot of focus on ensuring that we have enough information that we could prove to US Customs that there is no forced labor in our supply chain. And that, when you have fibers that might be, picked in one part of the country, ginned and milled in another part, fabric made in another part, trying to trace all the way down to that raw material level is quite a bit of a challenge. So forced labor is a very big issue. And then I'd say the third big issue that we're having is just finding the capacity with manufacturers around the world that meet all of our ethical and environmental concerns, that aren't already being overwhelmed with orders from other companies, right? So, the requirements for environmental impact and social responsibility have really grown in the last few years. So that sometimes limits the factory base that you can work with, because you only want to do business with those that your customer feels good purchasing product from. But you'll find that a lot of retailers are all going to those same factories. So there is a challenge from a capacity and a space perspective.
That's incredibly insightful. And it makes me think of, last year, Dr. Liu and I conducted a study on US fashion companies' evolving sourcing strategies. And one of the biggest things that we found was sourcing diversification was a notable trend. You talked a little bit at the beginning about these supply chain risks, transportation risks due to different geopolitical issues. Do you find that sourcing diversification is a popular way for fashion companies to mitigate trade compliance risks still? What's your observation going on in the industry currently?
Yeah, absolutely. We certainly have done that. We've diversified our supply chain quite a bit. Just casting forward a little bit. I don't know post the November election if diversifying it might actually help, because there's concern that there might be broad-based tariffs regardless of the countries that you're in. But certainly you have certain advantages working in some countries, particularly with regard to the US. If there's a free trade agreement, a bilateral trade agreement or a multilateral trade agreement that you can take advantage of, you might want to source in countries that give you that duty benefit from not having to pay that 15 to 35% in duty on your product. So that is one of the cost mitigation strategies that we employ, is look at countries that do have a trade agreement with the US. So sourcing diversification helps us there. We're certainly looking at Western Hemisphere, Central America, and South America from a diversification standpoint, really to mitigate that first issue that I just talked about with regard to supply chain disruptions. When you're not shipping as far, you can actually get the product to market a little bit faster. And you're not competing with as many of the big retailers that are in Asia for space. So that reduces some of the risk around the supply chain and transportation to diversify. One of the other things that we're finding as well, that I had touched on a little bit earlier, is that getting capacity in some of the countries where there was this pretty significant deleveraging out of China that we have seen, throughout the industry, with regard to the 301 tariffs that were imposed during the Trump administration, that made the costs a little bit more, the potential for forced labor, creating an admissibility issue that you're sourcing product there, and then you find you can't get the product into the US. It really had a lot of retailers looking at, how do we minimize that Chinese risk? I mean, there are still some things that China does better than anywhere else, that you really just can't get away completely from China, but diversifying away from it, gives us some of that flexibility in other countries to not have to be concerned about the tariffs at that time that were in place, or the potential for forced labor. And then just finally, looking to partner with factories maybe in new countries that we've never sourced from before, and kind of get our foot in the door and partner with those vendors, gives us that opportunity, because the urban product is very fashion sensitive. It's not a mass market product where we're doing just a lot of CMT work with t-shirts and shorts that are pretty easy. There's a lot of embellishments, a lot of burnouts, a lot of very highly technical products that we need to work with factories that understand that aesthetic. And we find by diversifying, we can find those factories and help build them up to support, our needs.
Sure. Thank you so much, Michael. This is so helpful. May I ask two follow-up questions? One is, you mentioned about diversification. So Emily and I know, we look at companies, their annual study, their annual report. We have the same finding. On one hand, companies, they try to source from more different kinds of countries, but at the same time, at the vendor level, some companies say they're reducing the number of vendors they work with. So why is that? What is your observation? And a second, we're just curious, you mentioned about working with vendors. So it look like, vendor can be great partner, to support, fashion brands and retailers, their efforts to control and mitigate the risk. So exactly, how you work with your vendors, and also how maybe at the very beginning, how you vetting and, evaluating your vendors to make sure that they can, give you the kind of the minimal sourcing risk or compliance risks.
Got it. So there's a lot to unpack there. And I'll start with the last part first. Is we do a significant amount of vetting from a social responsibility perspective. We are very aware that a lot of vendors have a lot more customers than us. So to avoid audit fatigue, we will accept audits that have been done, within a certain amount of time that we feel comfortable, to a certain certification, whether it's a RAP or an Intertech or an SGS, some audit, third-party auditor. that is accredited that we would accept. So we do a lot of vetting before we go into a factory. We typically on an annual basis will review those audits, and continue to ensure that the factories meet, our requirements from an ethical standpoint. From a vendor base perspective, we are in that same camp of trying to reduce the number of vendors that we do business with, because it does become a bit of a challenge to manage all of the various vendors. You have PO issues, you might have issues with regard to documentation in the various countries. And if you're constantly working with new vendors and large vendors, you end up spending a lot of your time just managing, not just the production of the goods, but all of the steps after it in the supply chain that get the goods imported. So we have been, trying to reduce that vendor base. The challenge with us is we sell so many different products that, we have found that a lot of factories like to specialize. So it's hard for us to give a lot of our business to any one factory, because they might only do sweaters and some might only do cotton sweaters, So it's hard, when you sell as many different products as Urban does, to shrink the vendor base, as small as we would like. Just going back in my past history, at Victoria's Secret, it was really easy to have a small vendor base because we didn't have a large, product line where, we were narrow and deep. It was underwear, bras, panties, and some other things. So we could really focus on a few key vendors. But when you really sell all products in a fashion apparel retail setting, you find out that you have to go to a lot of different factories. So in addition to the social responsibility, like I mentioned, the vendor relations team does report up into me, because we want to have a consistent standard by which new vendors are onboarded so that they can get up to speed fairly quickly, because we do need to be flexible if for some reason, there's unrest in Bangladesh, although we don't source much from Bangladesh at all, or, there might be inflation, in Turkey, or some other extraneous, situation occur that you need to move to another, area pretty quickly. We have to be ready to get those vendors up and running. And really one of the things that we value, is not just execution on the design of our product, it's also coming to us with design ideas of your own, or things as a vendor that you take an original tech pack from us and say, hey, if we do a couple things here, it would help us, from the perspective of we have less wastage, in the cutting, and we really want to find a partner that we can work with that can come to us with some suggestions as well, because we know that they're truly the experts in making the garments we buy.
Wow, this is all just incredibly fascinating. And, to build off of this, one thing that I've heard from everything that you've said is just how complex this fashion industry is. And especially on the compliance side, all the moving parts that you mentioned just on your day-to-day. It sounds super simple. No, I'm kidding. But I am really curious, with the rise of technologies, do you believe that new technologies such as AI tools, something that's been highly talked about over the last few years, could support fashion companies' trade compliance efforts? And how do you believe that AI could support, if you have any specific examples?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I think there's a lot of opportunity in the trade compliance area for AI to help, because there is a lot of data and documentation that goes along with any kind of international transaction, right? You've got POs, you've got packing lists, you have bills of lading, you have entry documents, you've got shipping documents after entry. So you have a tremendous amount of data that's just floating around there, that trying to mine that data can be a challenge. And so two of the areas that we're really looking forward to using AI to help us, with the trade and compliance is one, just the classification of product. So I don't know how familiar your audience might be with classification, but basically it's a 10-digit number that's assigned at the time of importation to identify for US Customs exactly what the product is that you're bringing in. It's a huge, the US tariff is a huge book, hundreds and hundreds of pages long. If you import anything from animals, to metal parts, to car parts, to fashion apparel, everything, chips, computers, you name it, everything has to be assigned this 10-digit number, this classification number. And with the volume of styles that we have, our hope is that we can kind of look at all of the data that we have for the products we bring in and bring an AI perspective to it to help with classification, because it is dramatically faster if you have the information to get to a classification with AI than to have an individual assign it. But at the same time, it has to be accurate, because you end up paying the US government hundreds of millions of dollars in duty on the basis of that tariff number. So, we want to make sure that there's high confidence that the AI that we're building is enabling us to help us with that. The other area that we think we have some opportunity, we had talked a little bit about it earlier with regard to how we vet new factories and how we manage the ongoing factory base that we have. And we're looking at AI to help us with the review of social compliance audits, so that we can look for, instead of having individuals in the trade compliance literally looking at hundreds, if not thousands of audits a year and picking out the ones where we might have concerns, which is a very small number, but you still have to go through them all. Our hope is that we could use, an AI solution to kind of go through and take an initial pass at those social compliance audits, and then call out for us the ones where they think there might be some additional review or risk that we would then take a look at a little bit more closely. So those are two very specific areas that touch on the duty aspect of the international trade, as well as the potential for forced labor. But I'm sure that as AI gets a little bit more robust, and as I'm sure, that people start looking at some of the things we do from a trade and compliance perspective, there'll be other opportunities for us to leverage that in the future.
Wow, that's incredibly fascinating. And I didn't even think about vetting factories and leveraging AI in that way. I know Dr. Liu is laughing. That's probably what he's already been thinking. But to shift gears a little bit, it still plays off this common theme of how complex the supply chain is. Some fashion companies say using recycled textiles makes it more challenging to map and trace their supply chain, as mandated by some legislation that you were discussing before. What's your view? Is there anything that can be done to solve this challenge? Is Urban experiencing this challenge?
So yes and no. It's incredibly complex. And it is something that we're considering, because we want to be able to offer to our customer more recycled product, more product with recycled content, because it is something that we know is important to the customer. We want to be able to make sure that we are very clear in, the responsible sourcing that we're doing, that we're not greenwashing, that we're certifying everything, if it truly is recycled material or recyclable, we want to make sure that we're very clear with the customer. But on the other side, the challenge is, when you go back to forced labor, is you need to be able to prove to the US government that there is no forced labor anywhere along the supply chain. Again, all the way from the harvesting up to the final manufacturer, and even, the shipping, there's some interest there. So when you have recycled content in, product, because one of the things we're looking at is recycled denim, like using some recycled fibers in denim. There is no way, if we import that we could ever get back to, where the original source of the original fibers are. And we have not run into that as an issue yet, but I don't know, if we ran into that issue, how we would actually be able to resolve that to customs satisfaction. So that is a challenge. We luckily have not had to deal with it yet. US Customs has acknowledged that it is a problem, but they unfortunately to date have not offered a solution to us.
Yeah, I think this is a perfect time to jump in. But thank you again, Michael, for sharing so many great insights. So you mentioned a couple of times about, policymakers, the government agencies, CBP or some other agencies. because, we have some, new rules here like UFLPA, and actually more and more, sustainability and the compliance related rules are being kind of created. So from your perspective or from your experiences, how policymakers can support fashion brands and retailers' effort to control the compliance risk? Because I think, by the end of the day, we share the same goal, right? We want safe products to be available to consumers. So how do you think policymakers, the government agency, and maybe some other stakeholders, the civil society can also support fashion brands and retailers' efforts to control and mitigate the risk, the sourcing and compliance risk?
Great question. I'm going to put a shameless plug for the US FIA, United States Fashion Industry Association, where Emily, you had mentioned I'm the vice chairman of. I have found in my career that engaging with industry associations is really the best way to amplify your voice to policymakers. Whether it's USFI, which of course I think is the best, or AAFA, RILA, NRF, all the trade associations offer the opportunity to benchmark and brainstorm with other companies that are in the same business. To your point, Sheng, we all want the same end goal. We want to be able to give product that excites and delights the customer, and they feel comfortable buying because it's a company they trust and that they're doing the right things, with the regard to the manufacturing of the product. So working through one of these trade associations, you really have an opportunity to speak to legislatures or the administrators of the different agencies that impact trade compliance, express your views, be able to publicly comment. That's one of the great things about the US government is, when a lot of these new regulations are going to be put into place that impact your company, there is a public comment period where you have the opportunity to, have your voice heard. And when they see something is coming from an organization that might have 30, 40, 50 different big retailers that are behind that statement, I think it carries more weight. So to me, that's the best way. Now, if you're very big, which unfortunately we're not as big as, say, a Target or a Walmart or an Amazon, you're going to have your own government affairs group, and they're going to have their own lobbying, that they do individually with, the different representatives. But, absent that, my suggestion would be to any company that might not have that type of resource to join an association so that you can be part of that group.
That's incredibly insightful. And, this interview has been so exciting for me personally. I'm sure for all the other students as well. To just conclude the interview, Michael, could you please offer some advice to our students interested in pursuing a career related to trade compliance? For example, what kind of career opportunities will there be? I know you said your own department grew exponentially, and how should students prepare while they're at school?
So this was a great question, and I guess I never really said how I fell into this, because I did fall into this business. I thought I was going to go into international law. I was taking international politics and some international economics classes. And then, before I went to law school, I just took a temporary position in an imports department. Never even knew that trade compliance existed as a career, because there's very few university, I don't know of any, I'm sure there are some out there that can really offer a degree in, say, trade compliance. Typically, you'll be able to take a few classes, as an aside to like a supply chain or transportation or logistics degree. You would take some trading compliance classes, part of, I'm sure, fashion and apparel at University of Delaware, that it's touched on trading compliance and just how important it is. So, the guidance I would give to, anybody who's interested in trade compliance is, one, be as well-rounded as you can be, from a business perspective, from a legal perspective. You'd be amazed at how much law you actually just deal with in trading compliance. I joke all the time, I didn't become a lawyer, but I have to hire a lot of them to manage all the things that we're responsible for. And really and I learned, as many people in this industry learn, is to start from the ground up and get exposure to as many different parts of the business as you can, because a lot of the people who end up in this industry for a long time have to learn it from the ground up. And as long as you're curious and you ask a lot of good questions, and you're really interested in, the intersection of fashion and business and law, trade compliance is, quite a great opportunity. We joke all the time that, we're the wizards here at Urban. People don't know what we do. We're kind of behind the curtain. And, all they know is we pull all the levers and then the product gets into the country, because there are so few customs and trade professionals, because there aren't, again, a lot of kids, I shouldn't say kids, a lot of young adults graduating with degrees in trade and compliance, that my suggestion would be, if you can get an internship, during your college years, that's a great opportunity to learn. If you could get in at the ground level at a company that, it gets exposure to a lot of these areas, that's another great thing. And then from a career path perspective, I've been doing it for a very long time. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the interview, it never gets less complex. We didn't even delve into the EU and the UK, which the regulatory and legal burden and compliance burden there is exponentially more difficult than the US. And that's where 12 of my team is, located now, because of Brexit and some of the changes that are ongoing with regard to sustainability and social responsibility in the EU. But you will never lack for opportunities in global trade and compliance.
Well, that's just so exciting. And, speaking personally, that was definitely what I experienced. Was I didn't know it even existed. And I was studying fashion for 4 years as a minor. But I definitely have fallen in love with it. And I look up to people like you and hope to one day be in a position like yours. This, sadly for me and Dr. Liu, concludes our interview. Again, thank you so much for joining us and sharing so many great insights for our students. I'm sure they're going to be very excited about it, Michael. We truly appreciate it.
Likewise.
My,
Thank you so much, Michael. Yeah.
my pleasure, and I appreciate you guys taking the time to hear what I had to say.
Thank you, Emily, too. Great job. All right.
Thanks, Dr. Liu.
Bye.